Hello, I'm journalist Christian Caryl, and I'm here today with Ian Vásquez, a vice president at the Cato Institute for International Studies. And we're here to talk about the Human Freedom Index, which is Cato's long-standing project to chart the progress of freedom around the world. Just in a few words, what is this index trying to achieve and why is it important?
Well, we co-published this with the Fraser Institute in Canada, and what we're trying to do is measure economic, personal, and civil liberties around the world to try to give a picture of the state of freedom. So we do that by measuring 86 different indicators in those areas. And that, I think, gives us a picture not just of where freedom stands now, but also where the trends have been over time.
How many other organizations are doing tracking like this?
This is really the only measure of its kind that's so comprehensive and also that is consistent with our definition of freedom, which is the absence of coercive constraint. That idea that you can lead your life as you wish as long as you respect the equal rights of others. And that's really what we're trying to get at with every measure.
Could you talk a little bit about the correlation between freedom as viewed through the prism of this index and economic well-being and prosperity?
What we find is a very strong relationship between freedom and indicators of human well-being, so that the countries that are freer are much more prosperous than the less free countries, but also they correlate with improvements and higher indicators and all sorts of measures of progress, so that with greater human freedom you have significantly longer lifespans, more access to safe drinking water, more innovation, better environmental performance.
One of the criteria that you cover in the index is openness to trade. And the whole idea of free trade and minimally regulated exchanges of goods and services among different countries has kind of got a bad reputation, especially in DC these days. Does your index kind of provide a counter-argument for that?
Every measure that we take into account in the index, we take into account because it has inherent value. We believe that freedom has inherent value, that trade should be voluntary, and that there should pretty much be a really good reason if you're going to be prohibited from doing so. What we see is a relationship between freedom and prosperity and economic freedom and prosperity, and that is, of course, true with regard to open trade. The world has not really deglobalized, but it is more protectionist than it used to be, and certainly the United States is, and we think that that's worrisome because it is an infringement on freedom and because free trade does really play a big role in standards of living. And I'm afraid that the United States has been, under both parties, heading more and more in the direction of trade protectionism.
So you just mentioned America, which is in some ways the elephant in the room here. America's place in the rankings has slipped rather steadily over the years. Why is that? Please give us some background on that.
Unfortunately, there's been a long-term decline, not just in the rankings, but in the ratings. The United States now ranks 17th on our index. In the year 2000, it was in the top 10. It ranked 7. And so what we have seen in the case of the United States, beginning in the year 2000, is that its level of economic freedom started to deteriorate right around the year 2000. Certainly in the aftermath of the financial crisis, it became even less economically free. And the same kind of pattern started to happen on personal freedoms, so that the United States today is far below its level of economic and other freedoms than it was in the year 2000. In the global story of human freedom, what we see is that freedom beginning in the year 2000 was on a steady incline right about through the years 2005 to 2007, which was really the high point of global freedom. And then we saw a steady decline in human freedom that coincided with the rise of authoritarian populism, nationalisms, all sorts of illiberalisms that we saw around the world. And then with the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, we just saw this big decline in freedom. It just fell off of a cliff.
What do you think are the larger factors driving this oft bemoaned democratic decline that we've seen in the past few years?
I don't think that there's one answer to the question of the rise of populism and different forms of illiberalism, and it does pose a big challenge to liberals. If freedom is such a good thing and it is associated with improvements in human well-being, then why have so many people or so many countries turn their back on that? And I think that the story that would explain that in Mexico is going to be very different than the story that would explain that in the United States compared to some European countries or Chile, for example. But if your analysis is that it was the policies of openness and freedom that were at fault, then naturally you're going to prescribe policies in the other direction, which I think is partially what happened in the United States. And it's during the last 15 years in so many countries, certainly in the United States, that you see this deterioration in trust and confidence in the major institutions in society that mediate problems or issues in society, including religious organizations, Congress, the executive, the Supreme Court, big businesses, the media. And when that happens, it reminds me of Latin America, where people are used to institutions not working, and so this is when the strong man comes in and says, I have the answers to the problems, and you can't really trust the institutions. I think ideology also plays a role. If you are told that the system is not good, that it's corrupt, and you are told that it only benefits the elite or the corporations are at fault. In the case of Chile, for example, ideology of the left, which had a public debate, had sort of a hegemonic role in most of the institutions, despite the fact that every indicator was showing success. I think that also certainly influences politics.
Could we talk briefly about COVID? What precisely was it about the COVID pandemic that limited freedom?
It had been a while since a global pandemic occurred, and it began in China, and China was the first to respond with a very communist and Chinese answer, which is to just lock down their cities and their country. It then spread to Italy, and this is an advanced democracy that decided to respond in the same way. And then countries started copying that. And what did that mean in practice? It meant that people had to stay at home. Freedom of movement was cut off, including from other countries into your own country. Trade slowed down quite a bit. At the same time, there were intrusions in personal freedoms, not just economic freedoms. We could go on through a lot of these indicators of freedom to see how they were affected. We really haven't seen in our lifetime in the West something quite like that. This was a catastrophe for freedom. That decrease in freedom affected more than 90% of the world's population in almost every area of freedom.
Could we talk a little bit about Ukraine? In this index, Ukraine slides quite substantially down in the rankings. So how does a war like that affect freedom in a country like Ukraine?
Well, we should say that Ukraine was never really a very free country. It was always in the bottom half of the index. War is, it has always been recognized as inimical to freedom, and one of the things that we've measured, that we measure in the index, is conflict. If you are living in a country that has internal conflict or international conflict, then you're more likely to get drafted or to die in a war. Your freedom is going to go down. But there's also been limits on media freedoms. There's also been limits on religious freedoms. The Russian Orthodox Church is in the government's view, a problem. And of course, limits on assembly and associations, the kind of things that you typically see countries engage in during times of war. So for that reason, you see that since the outbreak of the war, freedom has declined significantly in Ukraine, which had the misfortune to also suffer from the effects of COVID, just like the rest of the world. So it was kind of like it's been a double whammy for for Ukraine.
What a tragedy. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about a country that Americans don't seem to think about very much, but which happens to be the world's largest democracy, India.
Well, India is a story of a democracy that began to reform economically in the early 1990s, and that led to a big increase in per capita income. They've pulled out just millions of Indians out of poverty. And in that regard, it's a sort of a contrast to China, which is the other giant in the neighborhood that also increased its level of at least economic freedoms, and also for many decades achieved 9 to 10% growth rates, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The Indian model, which is democracy, has tended to be most successful when it moves in the direction of markets. In recent years, under Prime Minister Modi, what we've seen under his rule is a decline in overall human freedom, which I think is bad news for the country. Some indicators, like regulations, have become better, but it's a mixed bag. A lot of what we see there is typical of sort of right-wing populism that is going on. So the sort of the race between China, the China model, and the India model is still going on. But if you look at the Human Freedom Index and you see the countries that you might describe as populist, you see this pattern that when populism begins in those countries, human freedom starts falling. And it's usually falling in economic freedom indicators and personal freedom indicators. Certainly that's something that we've seen in the case of Hungary, in the case of Turkey, and in some other cases in the index, where you can clearly see the effect of populism on freedom.
Well, there's a question that I think automatically emerges from that, which is, we've just elected a populist government in the United States. Do you have any particular forecast based on the trends that you see in the index?
In terms of economic freedom, we may see an increase in economic freedom in terms of deregulation, but let's see how much gets done. I don't think that there's going to be an increase. I think there's going to be a decrease in terms of freedom to trade, especially if Trump actually does impose his 10 or 20% tariff rates to the rest of the world and other trade barriers that he's promising. I think that government spending under Trump is probably not going to get under control. And the more that the government and politicians decide how to spend your money, the less freedom you have. So in that regard too, I think that freedom will go down. But let's wait and see.
A number of the countries that get very, very good rankings are Northern European countries, which is quite striking because a lot of Americans tend to describe those countries or think of them as socialist.
I think that part of the confusion comes from the fact that some of those countries were more socialist decades ago, and at the time, like Sweden was touted as sort of the advanced socialist model that works, and yet by the early 1990s, Sweden turned its back to those policies and went into the direction of greater economic freedom. There is a high level of government spending, high taxes, and a big welfare state in those countries. But that's just one of many indicators. We have 86 different indicators that we think matter in terms of overall freedom. You have countries like Switzerland, which is number one in the index, that don't have the same high levels of welfare spending as the Nordic countries. So that it shows that you can have a successful, wealthy, and free country without following those policies that continue to sort of influence people's view of those countries as somehow being socialist, which they decidedly are not.
Very interesting. What were some of the biggest surprises to you in this year's index?
One thing that impressed me was the persistent impact of COVID on freedom around the world. Freedom is still at a level that's far below what it was in the year 2000. It really erases more than 2 decades of gains in human freedom. I think that one thing that may be going on, we'll have to wait and see, is that as many advanced democracies recover their freedoms, to more pre-COVID-like levels, you're going to see maybe a greater inequality in freedom around the world. There really is a striking inequality of freedom in the world, where in the top quartile of the index, only 14% of the world's population lives in the free countries, and 77% of the world's population lives in the bottom half. This is a striking level of inequality, and we think that that's a big problem for human progress and dignity.